We've already talked about the brainstem, the medulla oblongata, where we have these reflex centers to initiate a change in the rate and force of contraction of the heart. We've talked about different types of receptors that detect for chemicals, that detect for change in the pressure within a tubular structure, like a blood vessel. There are a number of various different things that we've already discussed and talked about. Now we're going to actually put that into use. And we're going to talk about regulation of blood flow, cardiac output, blood pressure, all of this stuff. We are going to have ways in which we can regulate our blood pressure and blood flow in the short term. And that's the vast majority of ways. We also have a long-term way to regulate blood pressure. But when we talk about long-term regulation of blood pressure, we are getting outside of the cardiovascular system. Now we're getting the lungs involved. Now we're getting the liver involved. Now we're getting the kidneys involved. So when it comes to long-term regulation of blood pressure, it becomes a much more complex dance in that regard. What would be an example of short term? Stand up. There you go. Did you pass out? Hope to God not. Getting up from a lying position, getting up from laying down. You just woke up. You got up out of bed. Did you fall over and pass out? No. Okay, good. That's short-term regulation at its most simplest. Okay. We will have a number of various different structures associated with short-term, and we'll have a number of hormones and secretions associated with long-term regulation here. Understanding what all of these do is going to be great from a number of multiple choice type questions. I could ask a big situation involving a situation where a person has, this is their blood pressure. What would be the short-term or long-term things that would happen for the heart to counteract the blood pressure that's occurring on that individual? Multiple different ways to ask it. But the vast majority of this last little bit here associated with the vessels is looking at short-term regulation. Okay? And short-term regulation is receptors. Short-term regulation is those autonomic reflex centers in the brainstem. Long-term is kidneys. Okay. Long-term is kidneys. So if you want to write that down here, long-term regulation of BP. That's when you get your kidneys involved in kidneys, liver, lungs. Okay. That's what we're going to have all of that action going on. All of those hormones that we're going to be talking about. And really, we're only talking about 3, 4, if you want to break it down a certain way. The reason why we have all of this regulation for blood pressure is really for one thing. And that is to maintain tissue perfusion. I want to maintain the amount of blood being delivered to all of the tissues. And it has to be in a certain range. You get too little, can't perform, can't do functions. And if it's too little getting to the brain, then that's when you're going to, get lightheaded and pass out. So it has to be high enough to maintain enough oxygen being delivered to the tissues. It can't be too high, though. It can't be so high that it damages vessels. So we have to be able to pump with just the right amount of force to ensure that we get delivery of enough oxygen. And just as important, getting oxygen there, but getting rid of metabolic waste. But not so high that we damage the tissues, because we don't want to do that. All right, we don't want to do that. This blood pressure is dependent upon a number of different things: cardiac output, rate and force of contraction. Cardiac output is influenced by the resistance, of which we've talked about: blood vessel diameter, blood vessel length, viscosity, and how much volume of fluids do we have? Is there anything affecting that volume? All of these things are regulated by I hope you didn't pass out, by the nervous system, chemoreceptors, baroreceptors, autonomic reflexes. Should not be a huge stretch, should not be passing out by that shocking piece of information. And then endocrine system. There's a number of hormones and secretions that are going to be involved in helping to maintain a normal blood pressure. So let's look at all these fun things. And again, for the most part, we've seen this stuff. Okay. We talked about autonomic reflexes. Good Lord. We've talked about the medulla oblongata, right? We talked about that cardiovascular center within the medulla oblongata. This is not new. Since we've talked about it in the nervous system, here it is. We're just putting it to use. Earlier, you had to remember that the cardiovascular center was in the medulla oblongata. It contained two sets of nuclei. One called the cardiac center, influencing the heart, affecting cardiac output. One, the vasomotor center, and that affects the blood vessels. Vaso is blood vessels. Motor means to do something, constrict or not constrict. To constrict or not constrict, that is the question. So we've already seen these. And this medulla oblongata helps to quickly adjust the blood pressure so that, when you do stand up, there are a number of changes that happen there. Sit there and just get up. Just stand up. Okay? What happens? Think about it. Slowly move it. Slowly stand up. Okay? And think about it. Okay? You get an increase in intra-abdominal pressure. Do you breathe? Okay. Well, depending upon where you're at in the breathing process will depend on where your thoracic pressure is. But if I just increase my intra-abdominal pressure, what am I doing? I'm pushing it up. I feel the pressure start to increase as soon as I start to move. I can feel the increased force in my head. I have some allergies too, so I'm super sensitive to that today. Okay. But lay down now. I don't have a bed here. Lay down. When you do that, you feel the pressure start to drop. So what's the heart going to do? We're going to see the actual pieces of machinery that are detecting these changes of pressure and what those are going to do to these reflex centers within the medulla oblongata. So if I just look at the cardiac center, all right, because we have two things that we can do, right? We can either increase cardiac output or we can decrease cardiac output. Easy. How do we do that? Autonomic nervous system. I can either increase the rate and force of heart work or I can decrease the rate and force of heart work. So if I look at this cardiac center, I'm going to have, shockingly, something that will cause acceleration and something that will inhibit it. And as long as you understand what sympathetic and what parasympathetic are from the previous unit, you already know. You already know there is absolutely, honestly, nothing to remember. Well, maybe one thing. Okay. You already know the heart. Okay. You already know that sympathetic is fight or flight. So you already know with sympathetic and fight or flight, that's going to accelerate the heart. We already talked about this in the last unit. Increases rate and force of contraction. Why? Because I want to get blood to the skeletal muscles so I can run like Carl Lewis to my car and not get attacked by the bobcat in the parking lot. So increasing heart rate and force of contraction. Guys, there is nothing really of huge consequence. The only thing that you may have to go and maybe memorize, which I hope to God not, what is the cardiac center synapsing on in terms of increasing rate and force of contraction? It is synapsing on two things. One, the pacemaker of the heart. Who's the pacemaker of the heart? The sinoatrial node. That is what sets the pace. So the cardioacceleratory center actually goes down in sympathetic fibers, go down and synapse on the SA node. And that causes it to depolarize faster. Electricity travels faster through the heart, through that nodal system. That electricity stimulates the myocardium so much faster. So that's increasing the rate of contraction. It also synapses on the myocardium. Where do you think that would synapse more of the myocardium? Who do I really want to increase the force of contraction from? The atria or the ventricles?
Ventricles.
Ventricles, right? Because that's the major pumper. That's what pumps it through the various different systems. Right ventricle pumps it to the pulmonary circuit, pulmonary system. Left ventricle pumps it through the systemic unit. Okay. So I guess if there's anything that you have to really memorize on that slide, that would be it. Okay. I want to rest. I want to sit down, relax, watch TV, relax for the day. I've been busting ass all day long. So now my cardio inhibitory center is going to become more active. This is parasympathetic, rest and digest. So it's going to decrease activity of the heart. I already know what parasympathetic does, rest and digest. And for the heart, it's going to inhibit it. It's going to cause it to slow down. I don't want to sit there and my heart be racing as I'm sitting there eating my chicken and broccoli. Okay. I need to find my life if that's what's happening. I probably need to go to the hospital. I'm probably going to die. Where does this go? What slows down the rate of heart contraction? The SA node. Also, the AV node. So the cardioacceleratory center, sympathetic, synapses on the SA node. Cardioinhibitory center, parasympathetic in nature. And this is going to synapse on not only the sinoatrial node, because that is the pacemaker of the cell, have I said that before? But it's also going to also synapse on the atrioventricular node. It does both. No myocardium involved here. Okay. I'm already decreasing the rate of electricity being generated from the nodal tissue. So that is enough to decrease contractions of the heart. Decreases cardiac output and blood pressure drops. There is constant information always going into this heart Okay. There's constant input coming into the medulla oblongata from a number of different things, which we will see here in a couple different slides from now. So this medulla oblongata is on the case. It has its own scouts within the system telling it what's going on in the body. And as soon as something happens, go to stand up. Those receptors sense that change, synapse up in the medulla oblongata, and either increase or inhibit the activity. So that's the cardiac center. Okay. At the cardiac center, check. The other part of this cardiovascular center within the medulla oblongata was the vasomotor center. Vasomotor center, we've already established, okay, is going in synapsing on blood vessels. There we go. Here we have, and I mean, here's a slide, here we go. There we go. Okay. I'm gonna go down and synapse on blood vessels here. Here, this vasomotor center is really going to be a lot of sympathetic input. We're going to release, hopefully you remember from the last unit, norepinephrine. We're also going to release epinephrine. We have not only norepinephrine being secreted, but we also get the adrenal gland involved. In the adrenal gland, we also secrete epinephrine. So we have two different hormones in the system here, causing sympathetic response to those blood vessels. We have alpha and beta. Don't worry about ones and twos and threes and fours, okay? Alpha and beta. On the exam, I think that's all I asked, okay? We have different types of receptors. Think of it as a different type of lock. Norepinephrine and epinephrine are the key. You put that key in a lock, and depending upon the lock, you get a different function. Back in the day, I'm going to sound like an old man, used to get a car key. Not a fob, not that nonsense, an actual key. And that key, when you put it in the ignition, would start the car. You take that same key and put it in the door and it would unlock your car. Take that same key and put it in your glove compartment, it would lock it or unlock it. Put it in your trunk and it would open the trunk. So different locks, same key, different outcome. And that's what we have here with norepinephrine and epinephrine. Depending upon what it docks to. We have alpha receptors on blood vessels. And alpha causes constriction. Let me know if something happens, okay? I've had some thing pop up on my screen, so if something happens, just please let me know. Beta receptors are involved with vasodilation, okay? Same key, norepinephrine and epinephrine being secreted by the vasomotor center. We have some blood vessels with alpha receptors, and this is going to stimulate blood vessel constriction. If I stimulate blood vessel constriction, blood vessels get smaller and blood pressure goes up. Some blood vessels have beta receptors. Vasodilation. Blood vessels open up. Blood pressure is going to drop. This is there for really one major thing, guys, right? To ensure that blood flow is constant, is consistent into the tissues. That's what this vasomotor center is really there for. To ensure blood flow into the tissue beds is constant and consistent. So it's going to help be protective. If I have an increase in peripheral resistance, that means I have to push with greater force to get the blood. So more blood vessels are going to be stimulated to constrict. So my blood pressure increases so I can overcome that peripheral resistance. Sorry, I was going to sneeze. What if we have a larger circulating volume? Well, now we're going to constrict veins, and we would have a larger circulating blood volume in terms of exercise. We're also going to redistribute where in the world we need blood to be going. Just because we increase blood within the arterial side of the vascular tree doesn't mean everything needs to be given blood equally on that arterial side. When you're exercising, do you want more blood to get to skeletal muscle, or do you want more blood to be delivered to your large and small intestine? I think that's fairly obvious. Okay. So not only will we get more blood out of the reservoirs, the veins, which will cause more blood to be delivered on the arterial side. But we're also going to redistribute how that blood flows to the various different structures. Areas with a lot of metabolic demand, going to need more blood. If I increase metabolic demand, what the hell does that mean? I need oxygen. I need oxygen to help deliver, or I need more blood to help deliver oxygen. So not only do I need more red blood cells to deliver oxygen to this metabolically active tissues, skeletal muscle, but I also need all that blood to also pick up all the metabolic waste and get rid of it. Okay, so we will redistribute blood flow and shunt more blood to the skeletal muscles instead of the stomach, the intestines, the digestive tract, if you will. Okay, I don't care. I don't care about processing nutrients as much as I care about increasing the activity of my skeletal muscles to run, to exercise, to lift weights. This can also be under stress. Okay. If you're under a lot of stress, what do people with a lot of stress generally have associated with them? Higher blood pressure. Why is that? Well, it's a sympathetic response. What if all of a sudden you sit there and you're daydreaming and you start thinking, oh my gosh, I have all this stuff I got to memorize. I got 3 tests next week. What happens? Sympathetic event. Okay. Memories. What if you're sitting there daydreaming about all the crap that you got to do, and you remembered the last time this happened, last semester, when you had a lot of stuff due at the end of the semester? Then all of a sudden now we're getting memories involved here, and limbic system, and that's stimulating a sympathetic event. What happens? All of this stuff happens. Blood vessels constrict. More blood is going to be distributed, and the body is going to have to try to reverse this in the short term, especially if you are going to be doing stuff. What do most of us do if we have an increase in blood pressure occurring? We get a headache, right? What do you take? Advil, ibuprofen, Excedrin, whatever, right? And that's going to interact with the various different receptors in these blood vessels to try to diminish that blood pressure by helping to kind of vasodilate a little bit and drop down that blood pressure. How in the world is this medulla oblongata sensing all of this nonsense? We have a few different pieces of machinery, scouts, if you will, that are out there looking around and trying to figure out what is going on so they can tell the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata can then tell the heart or blood vessels to respond in kind. And one of the major receptors that communicates with the medulla oblongata are your baroreceptors. Okay. And as you can see, we have 2 major baroreceptors. We have a baroreceptor in the aortic arch, and we have baroreceptors within the carotid sinus. And sinus, all it is just an expanded region of the blood vessel. And that's all you're seeing right there. Okay, kind of expanded there. Why these 2 locations? These baroreceptors are found in these two locations because of where the blood is going. In the aortic arch, we are basically getting ready to be distributed throughout the entire system. Okay, systemic circulation. So this is a receptor that is going to tell the medulla oblongata how much pressure is going to be exerted within the systemic system. Carotid sinus is basically telling the medulla oblongata what is going on with the brain. Well, it's really the head and the neck. But what's up within the head that is the most important structure of all? Obviously, it's the brain. So this is monitoring blood pressure to the brain. What's more important? Having a constant flow of blood to the brain or a constant flow of blood to your biceps muscle, to your stomach?
Brain.
Obviously. Thank you. Okay. So this is so much more sensitive than the aortic arch baroreceptor. If I don't get enough blood to the brain, we pass out. Okay. So the carotid sinus baroreceptor is going to be a hell of a lot more sensitive to blood pressure changes than the aortic. Now, how does it detect that? Well, what's a baroreceptor check for? Changes in pressure. Okay, so where are you going to find this sucker? In the walls of those blood vessels. Okay, and when you have a normal blood pressure, it's exerting a normal amount of force where it's pushing on the blood vessels at a normal rate. Okay, relax, contract, relax, contract. Remember, it's pulsable, right? Blood moving through the arteries, pulsable. You can just put your hand on it and you can feel it, right? So we are exerting a normal force every time the heart contracts and relax, contracts and relax, contracts and relax. And we have receptors in that blood vessel wall in that expanded region of the carotid artery, carotid sinus. And it's detecting that stretch that's occurring. Well, if all of a sudden I don't stretch as much, what's the body going to do? How would this blood vessel respond if there's not enough stretch occurring? Here's the normal stretch. Blood pressure drops. Am I exerting the same force on that blood vessel wall?
No.
Okay, so what's the body going to do to try to respond?
Constrict. the blood
Sympathetic.
vessel.
So it's going to constrict that blood vessel. So if we constrict the blood vessel, pressure goes back up. And now I start exerting the same force. And I've maintained, oh man, I did arms today. Oh my gosh, that was so hard. So I've maintained that blood pressure, right, going to the heart. Okay, let's reverse it. What the hell? What if I'm too much? What's it going to do? Too much pressure is being exerted on the wall. Now what's it going to do? Say it.
Dilate.
Dilate. Parasympathetic, right? So it's blood vessel is going to vasodilate, and now back to normal. Oh man, my arms are burning. Okay. So that's what these baroreceptors do. There's constant flow of information coming into that medulla oblongata. Okay. Constant flow of information in. The aortic arch is detecting systemic blood pressure. Again, it's just the force that gets exerted on that aortic arch by the left ventricle or right ventricle. Which one is it?
Left.
Left ventricle. Okay. So as soon as that left ventricle contracts, and remember, we contract from the top down, the atria both contract at the same time. The ventricles both contract at the same time, okay? But it's the left ventricle that is pumping through the system. As soon as that stretch occurs, sends that information up to the brain, or specifically the medulla oblongata. And as long as we're in our nice little normal range for blood pressure, maintains the status quo. Too little force will constrict. Too much force will dilate. Okay. And again, the carotid sinus is going to be more sensitive because we want to ensure the proper flow of blood to the brain. All that was just doing, okay, my little arm workout. There it is, okay? If the blood pressure increases, that stretch on the blood vessel increases the firing rate, going to stimulate the cardioacceleratory center to send less. So I guess I should say inhibit. Going to stimulate the cardioinhibitory center to be stimulated more. Vasodilation, decrease rate and force of contraction on the heart. So SA node and AV node will be stimulating the heart to decrease the rate and force of contractions. And those two things collectively help to regulate blood pressure. If blood pressure decreases, increase sympathetic output, vasomotor action, vasoconstriction, stimulate SA node and myocardium to increase the rate of depolarization, so increase the heart rate, and increase the force of contraction. All to save the blood flow to the brain. Because that's honestly the most important aspect. On the exam, could I give you a scenario and ask you to explain what's going on? Yes. Okay. And I'm either going to ask it as a multiple choice question or maybe as a potential small fill in the blank type of question. This is scenario. What's going to happen? What's the body going to do? Okay. We're going to have activation or inhibition of one of these two things. One of these three things, okay? What's the body going to do? Going to increase cardiac output, decrease cardiac output, increase vasoconstriction, or increase vasodilation. Again, I've asked it a whole bunch of different ways. Sometimes it's a short answer, 1 or 2 words. And sometimes I've asked it as a multiple choice type question, but you can guarantee your sweet little behinds that it will probably be on the exam. So I have baroreceptors. I also have chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors detect chemicals. What kind of chemicals? All of them. But which ones are we really worried about as of right now? Carbon dioxide and oxygen. Carbon dioxide and oxygen. So we have baroreceptors constantly sending in information to the medulla oblongata. We also have chemoreceptors sending in constant information to the medulla oblongata. Okay. This will not only affect the cardio system that we've been talking about, rate and force of contractions, vasomotor, all that nonsense, but this will also go and get the lungs involved here. Okay. And we'll talk about the lung aspect, the respiratory aspect in the next unit. Okay. In that last unit for the semester. We have, shockingly, chemoreceptors really in 2 major areas. in that carotid sinus, basically, and in the aortic arch, just like we had with the last one. It was in the picture. Okay, it was in the picture. Both of these chemoreceptors send information into the medulla oblongata. We have the aortic bodies in the aortic arch, and we have the carotid bodies in the common carotid, right where it starts to branch into the internal and external carotid arteries. It sends it via the vagus and the glossopharyngeal nerve. And I can't remember if I've asked that question on the exam. If I would ask one, vagus sounds familiar. I tried to put this test together over the weekend. So what are they detecting? Well, they're detecting carbon dioxide. They're detecting oxygen. They're also detecting pH as well, which would be hydrogen ion concentration. So if you want to put hydrogen ions here, okay, you can, because that's what pH is detecting, the presence of a lot of hydrogen ions or not a lot of hydrogen ions, okay? And depending upon how much of these various different chemicals we have, oxygen, carbon dioxide, or hydrogen ions, will influence this medulla oblongata. If we have a lot of carbon dioxide within the system, well, it's going to, as you can kind of see there, help us to increase blood pressure and shift blood to the lungs so we can exhale that carbon dioxide out and bring oxygen in. If we have very low pH, I can just increase my rate of respiration, and I can help to increase hydrogen ion concentrations within the blood. And I can help to maintain this normal pH. That one's, we'll get into that a hell of a lot more when we talk about the respiratory system, okay, in the next unit. But if I'm going to shift blood into the pulmonary circuit, what am I really going to affect here? I'm really going to affect those vasomotors. What is the pulmonary circuit? Is the pulmonary circuit by nature a very high pressure system or a very low pressure system? What do you guys think?
Low.
Low pressure system. Why would we want it to be low pressure system? You're correct. Why would we want it to be maintained low?
Have to be sent out like through the whole body, just over to the lungs.
Say that again. I was talking over you.
Because it doesn't have to be like sent out through the whole body, just over to the lungs.
So from a distance standpoint, it doesn't have to travel a whole huge amount of distance, correct? That's what you're saying. So
Right.
that is one reason. What's another reason why?
And it's more sensitive, right? Or it's thinner or
More delicate.
yeah.
We haven't gotten into the alveoli yet, but the alveoli are just one little thin, flat, squamous cell structure. And if you increase the pressure within those suckers way too much, you are going to blow them out. It's going to decrease your oxygen capacity within the lungs, and that's going to cause a whole amount of stress and strain on the body. So these are very delicate structures. So this pulmonary circuit is already set up to be a very low force type of thing. So I don't necessarily increase the rate and force of contraction on the heart. There's also a structure in there called the moderator band, which limits the amount of contraction that the right ventricle can do anyway. We didn't get into that. But how does it deliver more goods? By opening up, okay? Vasomotor, dilate that blood vessel so I can get more blood flow into the lungs and get this exchange of oxygen and CO2. So we have baroreceptors, we have chemoreceptors. The last little bit of kind of short-term regulation is kind of the hypothalamus, the limbic system. The hypothalamus can affect it because, well, we didn't get into it because we don't have enough time, but the hypothalamus is like the master control for a lot of different hormones and uh, secretions, and it can increase body temperature, which would increase a metabolic demand on the body. So we associate that with a fight or flight type of response. So hypothalamus can increase heart rate, excuse me. Limbic system with emotions and memories. I made reference to that a little bit earlier. It can also do it as well.